Hello, hello. I'll give everyone a moment here to connect to sound. Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rails 1326th New Social Environment. I'm Joshua, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Alison Nguyen and Lumi Tan. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Alison Nguyen is a visual artist and filmmaker working across video, installation, and sculpture. Her practice combines the particulars of the personal with an exploration into broader forces of history. With approaches of speculative fiction, documentary research, and performance, Nguyen's practice proposes counter-mythologies. Nguyen's work has been presented internationally in galleries and institutions and in film festivals. She received her M.F.A. in visual art from Columbia University and her B.A. in literary arts from Brown University. She was a 2023-2024 Studio Fellow at the Whitney Independent Study Program. Our host today, Lumi Tan, is an independent curator and writer based in New York City, specializing in interdisciplinary exhibitions and performances. Current and upcoming projects include those at Doosan Gallery in Seoul, Performance Space New York, and the 2026 Converge 45 citywide exhibition in Portland, Oregon. She has been the curator of the focus section at Frieze New York since 2024. From 2022 to 2024, she was the curatorial director of Luna Luna, and prior to that, she was senior curator at The Kitchen, where over a 12-year tenure, she organized over 100 exhibitions and performances. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Art Forum, Frieze, Moose, Cura, Art in America, and many exhibition catalogs and artist monographs. And with that, I'll go ahead and pass the mic over to Lumi.
Thanks so much, Joshua. It's always such a pleasure to be part of the NSE. Thank you to the Brooklyn Rail team for always making this experience so seamless and easy for everybody. So the exhibition, Perforation Ellipse, at Storefront for Art and Architecture. Oh, wait, it's all in there already. I was going to say it opened on January 28th and it'll be open until March 28th. And so, I'm sure many of you in the audience have seen the exhibition already. But for those who haven't, we decided to begin with some documentation of the exhibition because, as Allison has mentioned, it is a 10-channel installation in a very particular space. And so we thought it would be very helpful to start with the documentation to ground us all in how the exhibition is kind of laid out and give a sense of how it looks and sounds. So we can play that video now.
Thiên nhiên như tình giấc, mùa hè đưa ta tới hồng hoang, trần truồng yêu nhau trong trời đất, mùa hè của.
All right, thank you. So Allison, the central image of the exhibition is, on the largest screen and kind of in the center of the room is of you shooting an arrow, and it's very notably filmed on 16 millimeter. And this, as it kind of states in the wall text, is a reference to a philosophical argument called Zeno's paradox. And this argument is really a through line to this show. And so I was wondering if you could give a brief explanation of what Zeno's paradox is to the audience. Sorry for a hardball question right at the beginning,
I
but
know, Lumi, start off with the easy one. I am going to be a bit reductive in this just for the
please,
sake of time.
of
But
course.
yeah, Zeno's paradox is a philosophical contradiction, where it's often linked to studies of infinity, right? Within quantum philosophy, but it essentially states that time is divisible into infinite pieces of stillness, right? And I suppose in thinking, this work has a lot to do with my exploration of time, what time means in terms of cinema, in terms of movement, in terms of identity, right? Um, and this work contains a lot of these experiments, really interrogating what time is in moving image through various forms, right? What a better way to experiment with time than direct animation, where you're taking 16 millimeter film leader and painting it, animating it, but really calculating the length, right? So understanding time, duration, and space in that way. But archery is a pastime of mine. And I was thinking, I was inspired by Zeno's paradox, thinking about the complexities of it, wanting to push against it also in certain ways. But the arrow is like such a symbol of time. So I had this idea for a performance wherein I would be shooting within a space in New York, at a target which is not important, and which is off screen. And I thought that was an interesting score of sorts, or a way to structure the installation. But yeah, using Zeno's paradox as a point of departure, right? And deliberately using two 400-foot rolls of 16 millimeter film as the constraint. Constraints are always good with me in performance. But yeah, using that and thinking about, stillness, the gaps in between frames, how cinema in some ways refutes Zeno's paradox, and thinking of lived time or lived experience, right, in relationship to much of the work.
Yeah, I think, I mean, obviously the spatio-temporality of both film and diaspora is, such a expansive topic that is core to the show. And I have found the kind of handout for the show really helpful in kind of structuring this conversation, just because these concepts are so large.
Mhm.
But so one of the essays in this handout is Lucas Brasikish. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Has the arrow never left, and so he speaks to Zeno's paradox directly. And so I'll just read a short quote. So he says, cinema gives Zeno's understanding a body, showing that what returns is never simply what is seen on screen, but also what is withheld. Ellipses, cuts, interruptions, and partial stories have become the very means by which memory survives the dominance and power and displacement, carrying in it fragments that re-enter the present every time they are projected. And I think you've already touched a lot on the materiality of film within this installation. But I wanted to speak to, kind of the relationship between cinema and installation in this case, where, I think the what I think his text is really pushing against is that cinema is not a passive experience, and your installation really makes through its 10 channels and how it's kind of laid out in this, kind of triangular or wedge-shaped gallery, the partiality and the withholding really evident. And, you're using parts of your single channel film, which is a bit more narrative, called Aisle 9, and which was also recently screened at Anthology Film Archives as part of the exhibition. So yeah, just to reiterate, just speaking through your relationship to film and installation in this sense.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I show work in multiple formats, in cinemas and multi-channel installations. And these are always really very, very distinct edits. I love both gallery context and cinema. But with cinema, I always push against the domination of it, right? In one sense, I love trapping people in a black room and having them pay attention to the work with such, undividedness. At the same time, it can be very totalizing. And so I wanted to experiment with really taking cinema apart in this work, and creating a nonlinear experience, which is more affective than it is cerebral, I suppose. Even though there are a lot of philosophical, ethnographic ideas that circulate within it, I wanted it to be more about feeling and sense, um, than about information, I suppose, or a fixed meaning, right? Um, but yeah, in short, I treat my archive, as I was saying, like found footage, and work very freely, with this material, pushing back, distinctly against this idea of the master copy, right,
Yeah.
in cinema. But I think it's like, this kind of, I don't know, this love and hatred of, the dominance of cinema is a really animating part of my practice, I think. Loving it, but also wanting to untangle it or make it my own language in a different way, right?
Yeah, I think that's really felt by all the different kind of footages that are used in the installation and how you kind of highlight like the scene missing frame and
Mhm.
how these um, again these like material and formal qualities of the film are really forefronted and perhaps like certain maybe certain generations like have never seen that before within a video installation. um and the spatiotemporality of the installation is not, only explored through the experience of film, but also of diaspora,
Mhm.
which is the, I would say like second overarching theme within the show. And the exhibition itself is part of a series at Storefront called Homelands, which delves I'll read just directly from Storefront's description of it, which is it delves into the political dimensions of memory, examining what is obscured or distorted in the dominant record through the works of artists and architects who unmake and remake their connection to place. And another text you've reprinted is Through the Lens of the Chronotype by Esther Perrine.
Mhm.
And the chronotype is a term that I'm sure many of you in the audience know, that Russian literary scholar Mikhail Bakhtin used in the 1930s to discuss how time and space are represented and produce meaning in language. And so Perrine writes, understanding diaspora chronotopically means thinking of the homeland not as left behind in a static, pure, untouched state and recoverable by a simple return to a location on the map, but as a construct symbolically kept in place by out-of-place subjects. Diaspora, then, is characterized by the way in which dispersed communities connect themselves to each other and to the homeland by forging relationships across space and time through a shared, performative, habitual mnemonic construction of space-time, a shared chronotype. So, another huge part of the show and a very affective part of the show is, your use of, and I'm going to say it in my Southern diasporic accent, yak yang, or yellow music, which is also known as Vietnamese bolero. And I think this genre is really loaded in like crossing this time space for the Vietnamese diaspora and the way that you've integrated into the exhibition in terms of kind of performance and sound and the way that the lyrics appear on screen and then kind of disappear and dissolve like in a very I would say like soft way compared to kind of like, let's say the more stricter edits of like the filmed footage of, your filmed footage. Um, like all of these things are very integrated within the video installation. So could you talk about just kind of the editing process of that before we dive into the more logistical aspects of working with these performances?
Sure, sure. I mean, I guess to approach the question somewhat abstractly at first, but
Yeah.
speaking to Esther Perrin's essay, when I got the invitation to be a part of this series called Homelands, um, at first I was like, "Ugh, like Homeland, it's such a, I think of home or like the construction of home as this compilation of mythologies, right? Like this kind of unreachable ideal centered around this imaginary origin point, which I take issue with in certain ways. So I wanted to think of homeland not so much in terms of space. It's often linked to a territory or a place on the map, but thinking about it more in terms of space and time and that inextricable linkage, right? And I felt that, moving image was a really good way to experiment with that. Um, in my work, I often think about the transhistorical. So within sculpture, especially, I seek to create these objects that cut through different epochs of time. Um, I know that sounds very lofty. Whether I'm successful or not, is up to the viewer, but that's the intention when I work with these like larger scale objects. Um, so I think like with the puncturing of the film material, I'm thinking about holes, right, in the archive that are places of possibility, right? Obviously, and you know this so well, there is so much missing in the archive surrounding the Vietnam War. And wanting to address that in a way that is not you know, didactic or taking a stance of like, you know, um, privatized knowledge, right? But really exploring this through feeling and emotion. Music is such an important part of this work, and the Bolero music comes as a sense of, I think, relief when these holes are punctured, right, in the film. Um, and for people who haven't seen the show, this often occurs when a film leader that says scene missing shows up on the screens. And this film leader is really used in like an editing process or was used in an editing process where editors would leave like, feet and feet of scene missing film leader to insert a scene. It was also used in terms of censorship, right? When a scene was removed, right? So when the film is punctured, the music begins to play. And that was how I began to structure the work. Yeah.
And, speaking to kind of the withholding within the
Mhm.
installation, I mean, I think obviously it happens on so many levels, but, for people who have seen the kind of entire Aisle 9 film, you understand that, like, the scenes that are in this installation are, when these workers in a warehouse have like opened these boxes of kind of censored material and they just, the sense is that these workers are in a kind of near dystopian future, which obviously feels closer and closer every day for us. And we're all grappling with issues of censorship in the arts in real time right now. Um, but something that's really that I noticed, in my position as someone who's seen like both the full film and this installation is just how the edits of that film really allow you to kind of concentrate on these details of like a moment in time, right? Like you
Mhm.
see like these technological artifacts like a cell phone or a CD that like you kind of identify with a recent past, and the musicians are playing songs from, past decades, but you kind of understand in how they're filmed and how they sound and kind of their environments, that these are kind of recent performances of these older songs. And just to go back to the kind of history of this bolero music, this was music that was very popular kind of around the time of the war, and then was censored once the war kind of was ended, and has kind of carried on through the diaspora in like through media, essentially, like, through videos that circulated in diasporic communities, and now, of course, on the internet. So the way that you kind of play with, this footage that is perhaps rooted in one time but points to another, you also use kind of archive, footage that is clearly archival news footage or documentary footage. And you're, as a viewer, you're experiencing all of this at once and kind of walking through it, or maybe standing at the back and seeing it all, you're being confronted by it all at once. Um, you're really kind of pulled in and like pushed out of certain moments in time, let's say.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess going back to the editing process, I filmed the performance, right? Not really knowing exactly how this would pan out. And not wanting to, let's say, shoot the arrow according to when I envisioned the footage, right? Maybe it was a stupid thing to do or a blindsided thing to do, but for me, I really liked that risk, of creating a performance knowing that there would be media playing in between these breaks, but not really having a fixed idea of what that might be. Um, my research into the YouTube bolero singers came after that, right?
Okay.
So thinking, that was really the structure. And then I knew there would be these perforations and these breaks in time, and then there would be other material. But at the outset, beyond that, that was just this initial instinct, right? This shape. And I think for me, both the concept, the research, and the kind of gut instinct, they're equally as important, right? Like I feel like you can think through things and research and conceptualize, but then your hunch, your instinct, paying attention to the material itself and letting that teach you, is as important, right? In terms of the singers, I came up with a list of songs that had been censored, right? Bolero music that had been censored, and then found their modern covers. I love cover songs as a genre. I could make work about cover songs, until I'm quite old. But I responded to people I just really kind of fell in love with, in the way that they sang. And then with the help of this really phenomenal translator based in Vietnam, Huey Nguyen, we reached out to people on YouTube asking for their permission, telling them a little bit about, the exhibition and the context. Also explaining that these would just be very small bursts, right, of their footage. And, it was kind of by process of who got back to us, dictating which footage we used. And this also led to the inclusion of these really special documents that are seen on the screen right now. These golden circles have lyrics, handwritten notes, ephemera from composers of bolero music. Most are deceased. Maybe one is alive, but some of the singers in these videos supplied these because they knew the composer and had, ephemera or journals in the case of Pham Dui within their possession. And that was really exciting to be able to discover that and include it in the work. In terms of the direct animation that you see, that was a way for me to kind of indicate a mental process of actually not being able to kind of fathom things or understand them myself, right? It's this process of thinking through, of affect, of pleasure, right? The pleasure of color, um, but really kind of grappling to find a language. And I wanted to make that visible at times in the work. What else? I'm trying to think.
I mean, that description of the direct animation also feels very relevant to just kind of like the negotiation of like the your diasporic position
Mhm.
within um this, the construction of this piece. And um I was wondering about like any kind of like negotiations that like your translator had to go through in terms of um, kind of like explaining what this information was going to be used for.
Mhm.
If there were certain like sensitivities around its use or anything like that.
Sure. I mean, just for context, Bolero music originated in the South primarily. And so within the government in Vietnam as it stands, people who hold on to the Southern government are essentially traitors, are seen as traitors in certain circumstances. Um, and so, actually creating this project made me realize how how soaked in the Southern perspective, my father's from Saigon. I was, really kind of zooming out and thinking, oh, okay, I really have to tread very lightly with this, with certain people. Um, Most were very open and willing. And, we sent them the text surrounding the show, gave them a sense of what the edit might be like. There was one performer who wanted to know, like, am I in support of the former Southern government? Um, and I told Hui, tell him like, I dislike all governments, and I would probably never make a work that was, vocally in support of a political cause, actually, um, in an overt sense, of course. Um, but yeah, that was interesting. And then after she explained, this is more about censorship and the transmutation of cultural forms, he came down. He was able to understand, but it was an interesting kind of back and forth, right? I was like, that would just be bad art, right? If I was like waving the former South Vietnamese flag. Um, but yeah, that was interesting. And then, of course, like there's these amazing discoveries that I mentioned where singers from the Dukan group, which we saw in the excerpt, were friends with Pham Duy and had these amazing documents and were so generous with sharing them, right? And so in some ways the work is, kind of creating a counter archive, right? Attempting to in the way that an artist can, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. How did you decide to um, kind of translate this information into the kind of final form in the exhibition, which is gold leaf on aluminum?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've worked with gold for a while, in a very clean way. And so I always want to kind of like contradict what I'm doing for better or for worse. Um, I also love gold in the sense that, you know, I like using it in a digital way sometimes, like combining digital material with gold. It has such a historical importance to it. It's what was in the illuminated manuscripts that
Right.
have lasted for hundreds of years. And with that in mind, I really wanted to take these sort of fugitive artifacts, right, and imbue them with an importance, right? To preserve them in some ways, but also to kind of cheekily play with the term "knock bang," um, which was used in some ways disparagingly.
Right.
Um, gold music, yellow music, and kind of take it and flip it, right? But also just to create something beautiful, right? That has its own light source in some ways.
Yeah, and I think for, people who haven't experienced the exhibition or are not familiar with the music, I mean, the music was censored because of its sentimentality and romanticism. Um, and so, there is like if all music has a emotional pull within space, this especially does. It's like there's a lot of longing, and the what obviously that emotionality was something that communism stood against, but also just there were many references to, the war as a point of separation, both from like someone you loved, but also from like a land that you've loved,
Mhm.
or like a feeling of distance between you and a place you've once known. So there's something really beautiful about the way that you've kind of taken that information and made it into, or that, these kind of fleeting emotions of like a song and put it into something that's more permanent and um, archival and, through the artistic lens.
Thank you. Yeah, and I felt like having the English translation fairly close to the work was important. I know not many people speak Vietnamese. I, for one, am not fluent. But having like this very easy way to understand that these works, were not like calling for violence
Right,
or
right.
overtly political, but were really about love and, often a call for peace, right? Um, Wanting to stop the violence of the war. So thinking through how and why that was censored, is somewhat devastating, right? At the same time, like, so I mean, I do include in some of these captions how they were censored and when the
Yes.
ban was lifted, um, wanting to have like a light touch on the kind of political context of these, right? But also wanting viewers to enjoy just the beauty of these lyrics, which are often like, just great pop love songs about sadness, right?
Yeah, I unfortunately, when I was on my research trip to Vietnam last year, missed by a night like the group trip to see Wing Van Loc perform his like
Uh,
residency at like a Hanoi cafe.
uh-huh.
And like I think it was like a very, very emotional moment for like Americans kind of visiting Vietnam for the first time and hearing this music in its kind of like quote unquote like original context by a singer who had been arrested and imprisoned and prevented from singing these songs for decades. And now he's, just has his weekly, or I think it's weekly or bi-weekly audience at a regular cafe in Hanoi.
Yeah, which is so amazing. And that song that he was imprisoned for, Niêm Quoc Ko, is within the wall works, but it's also in aisle 9. I got, I negotiated the licensing rights with the Vietnamese Cultural Association to use it in the moving image work and screen it, right? Um, Aisle 9 is a speculative fiction and, it's an experimental narrative, but I always feel like mixing in reality to fiction is interesting in part because reality is so much more intense and,
Yes,
wild than anything I could possibly, dream up or think up. So that,
absolutely.
yeah, combining the real and the narrative fiction is really important to me.
Um, and then I wanted to, I mean, since you brought up your dislike of Olga Hermans, touch on the use of the text that is kind of seen throughout the installation, which is very much set apart from the lyrics that are kind of on screen. Um, so I don't think it's as well, I guess it is. It is in the handout, but it's not necessarily like credited within the installation as Sylvia Federici's Ricci's In Praise of Conspiracy Theory from
Mhm.
1985. And I know that you've used this poem in kind of other forms, in installations with Aisle 9. So could you talk about how this was integrated into this particular exhibition?
Sure.
And also like what the poem, means to you.
Definitely. I mean, this is I came across Sylvia Federici's poem maybe in 2022. And it is really a piece of writing that has haunted me. She wrote this in 1985, around the time when she was very critical of the World Bank, right? And doing a lot of activism and writing around that. But she takes a really interesting stance on conspiracy theory in the poem. She says, thank God for conspiracy theory. Like, it's because of conspiracy theory that we're able to make these links, in power structures and see through these holes, right? And be critical, of the powers that govern us. Um, I know it's kind of like terrible to summarize a poem, but she takes a term which is often used to like kind of, describe people online, or it's used negatively sometimes. And she turns it, right, and says, no, thank God for, suspicion or for us connecting the dots, because this is actually really important, you know. Um, it's important for us to question authority, to question power. Um, and I contacted her very shyly.
Okay.
I felt like a fangirl. I reached out to her and, just humbly described why I loved it and how I wanted to use it. Um, and she wrote back immediately, "Oh, yes, please use it." It's very important today. And yeah, and since then, I've updated her, can I use it in this? Oh, of course. How should I credit you? Oh, you don't need to credit me. But if you want, it can just be my name. So she's been a really generous interlocutor. But I find that this poem really helps bring together disparate aspects of the work, Aisle 9, in conversation with other elements of my practice. It's kind of like a bracket or a hinge, in the work, casting meaning on elements that might seem a bit obscure. Um, but at the same time, it's like I'm really threading it. You can read it,
Yeah.
you can not read it, you can grasp parts of it. Um, but yeah, thinking about conspiracy in a more nuanced way, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, again, extremely relevant to the position we're in right now in terms of, what are the motivations behind decisions and how do those decisions oppress and impact all of us. Um, but also just this idea of, circumventing surveillance and kind of like believing in other structures that kind of um, I guess like allow us to imagine. And
Yeah.
I just think about like I've been thinking so much about censorship and um, artistic production and that sense of like I think like conspiracy and that kind of way of seeing the world is very can be very helpful in an
Yeah.
increasing surveillance state.
Yeah. And like needing to have conspiracy
Exactly,
with
exactly.
each
Like,
other, right? To protect ourselves, right? The kind of if you know, you know nature in which artists and cultural workers have to move, right? But thinking about censorship also not just in a binary of freedom and expression, but thinking about the historical connections, the systemic connections within censorship itself, right? I went down a very deep research dive with
I'm
this.
I'm sure.
Yeah, but I mean, I think wanting in aisle 9, workers in a factory discover this censored material, right? in boxes from a fake tech company called World Global Services. And, much to their surprise, it's not political material, it's material of everyday life, right? And they begin to turn this aisle of the warehouse into a micro cinema, and show the censored material out of context, and it's strange. Um, and with the hope that, these memories can pass through the screen and live on in a different way that might not be determined. And I think it's like definitely the most hopeful work I've
Yeah.
made, you know? But when I was creating this, this body of work, it was just such a dark time. I began researching not too long after October 7th, and the amount of censorship and self-censorship that I saw is just so devastating, right? And so then what do you do with all of that? Um, so I mean, I hope that the work offers some kind of possibility.
And I know that also for Aisle 9, in the kind of full film, that you sourced a lot of the material that's seen on these screens from other artists,
Hmm.
in addition to more archival footage. Could you talk about that process a bit and if that kind of helps you through this moment, to kind
Yeah,
of gather these materials
sure.
and create your own archive essentially of them?
Yeah, so I was really intent on filming the material on TV screens, and various devices live for the film, which was a very ambitious process. It was like doing a 20 channel installation. And what should be on the content of the screens. There were certain archival pieces that I was set on, but to create this feeling of media from everyday life, I opened a call to friends and people who I thought might be interested within the art community and elsewhere, with the prompt of like the speculative fiction and referencing Jonas Mikas's Walden, Bunny Rogers's video diaries, media that really speaks to the quotidian, right? That would be devastating to have, you know, taken away, right? Um, and so there's multiple layers. Also, there's some work that has been censored in New York in various ways. So I felt like that was important to have embedded, in the piece. So there's a lot there, but amazing collaborators and supporters that were a part of this film who were really generous um, with their material. And it's credited in the installation in these very large plastic envelopes that hang on like a job rack. And I have the file names and like the names of the work if people wanted to provide it. And then in the film, it's a little bit more straightforward. I have it just in the end credits. Um, but I feel like that citation is a big part of the work.
And just to be clear, that is the installation, like the previous installation of Isle 9, because those did
Yes.
not.
Oh, sorry,
Yeah,
sorry.
those do not exist in the current installation.
No, no, no. That was for an installation I did in Hong Kong and in Taipei called Prosthetic Memory. Where that was when Isle 9 was first shown.
And since we just showed an image of like I would say like the back of the wedge of the storefront space, and how there's like this one single monitor there that, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I only comes on when the music
Hmm.
videos come on, correct?
Yes.
So I just wanted to talk about the like choreography of the space a little bit in that editing, because it is, it is such a specific space, and how that kind of influenced your, placing the screens on these carts, like the placements of the carts, things like that. And just also like the sound mixing, which you've previously mentioned was like, very intentional in terms of um, creating both sounds of kind of like, or bringing forth like a sense of nostalgia, but also kind of like eeriness or
Mhm.
alterity. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess when I first entered the storefront space with the idea of the show in mind, I was like, huh, okay. No, no, no. I mean, I love site-specific work, but I suppose one of the challenges of the very long triangle that storefront is, how to choreograph it, as you said. I think that's a great term, but how to, especially with sound, how to have it travel through the space in an interesting way. Um, and for me, I wanted the Bolero music to sound like a murmur,
Hmm.
to sound nostalgic, to sound, as you mentioned, somewhat eerie, but also to mix these different registers of sound. The sound that you hear that's connected to the archery performance, it's a lot of layers went into the sound design for that. It gets like quite surreal at times. John Flores, the sound designer I work with, we really messed with the sound of the arrow
Okay.
in certain instances and kept sounds of the city, but also tried to anticipate the sounds of the city that were actually surrounding storefront, which is quite a
Right.
forest space. So taking that into account. But I don't think it's so interesting to have like all very like slick, well designed sound. I think it can be a bit boring. And so and also I wanted to maintain the objectness of these
Right.
monitors, right? And what a better way than to play the sound directly from the screens, which is like, an AV kind of like a no-no, but
Right. Right.
I happen to love it. And the screens stick out of, the pegboard carts that they're on in a way where it's kind of like appendages. There's like an anthropomorphic quality to it. And I just fell in love with this idea of this chorus of murmurs. But then how to, have that travel through the space. And so I thought it would be interesting to have one monitor at the very tip, right?
Hmm.
That is encased in metal so that there's a different kind of vibration to it. Um, I love the way that metal reflects sound, and creates different frequencies within sound. Um, so yeah, but also wanting to withhold a bit and just play with light and play with color. Because the video installation on the right is so dense in some ways.
Yes.
Yeah. So wanting to have these different notes and, you know, um, concerns of space and time within the installation.
Yeah, I think that there's certainly a sense of like, I mean, the storefront space can feel very sealed off,
Mhm.
and I was just thinking about like the ways in which um, the warehouse staff of aisle 9, like they're not allowed to leave the warehouse because of kind of these uh, like unexplained dangers that are outside the door, right? Like everyone's staying. It's clear that it's not safe to go outside, but you're not exactly sure why. And there's
Mhm.
something about being like held in the storefront space in the same way. It's like if someone like opens, because the door goes directly onto the street, like if someone opens the door, then like natural light comes in, and like it completely changes the feeling of this
Mhm.
of the installation and kind of like how you're held within the sound and the image there.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, I totally agree. No, I think like I was very set on it being an immersive space, which is not something that Storefront does all the time in their exhibitions. And really wanting to think through the experience of light and sound, but also taking into account these interruptions, right? Like the ambient sound from the street
Right.
being a part of it. Embracing the space, not trying to turn it into like um, a slick gallery, right? But really taking into account the site and also the history, the object that you pointed out at the tip of the triangle, it's for sure a nod and like kind of an homage to Shigeko Kubota, who was very influential to me when I first started making video art. Again, thinking through the objectness of video, right? And there are many nods to previous generations of artists in this work. And the newsprint Tak Inomura is mentioned, or there's an artifact that I have from one of his performances. And that is really special to me. When he was alive, he and Akiko were friends and actually introduced me to many collaborators, friends, people who really nurtured my early work at Anthology Film Archives. And I met them just at one of his exhibitions at Microscope Gallery. So there's a lot embedded in the work in terms of the space and the history and wanting to pay homage to artists who really kind of built the way for video work.
And maybe just as a last question, I mean, relatedly, like, you've talked about using your past work as found footage. Do you feel like, this will kind of iterate into a next project? Or, I mean, obviously, you've put so much research into this. Do you feel like you're kind of thinking about the next way in which you can use this material?
Yeah, I mean, I will be showing it in Busan at
Oh, great.
the biennial. Probably not supposed to say that. In August. And so I am thinking through, ways I might expand the material. Also thinking about the possible site and how the work might change in response to that site. But I think that with the wall works, I really want to continue that more immediately and create more. Gilding is like a very strange meditative practice in some ways. It's like freak magic. It's very
Hmm.
alchemical. And something that, I really love doing alongside the more kind of nitty-gritty editing and filming. Having like this touch of the hand in the work is really important. So I plan on expanding that and, not making like large changes in the video, but having the video respond more to a potential site.
And will you kind of continue reaching out to these performers online who, in terms of continuing this wall work, will that research continue?
Yeah, definitely. That's something I'm really excited about.
Right. Well, Josh, I think this is a good time to start the Q&A.
Thank you both so much for that conversation. We're going to go ahead and transition to our audience Q&A. So if you are in the audience and you have a question for Allison, we welcome you to submit your question via the link in the chat. And we'll try our best to get to you. We have a couple questions here lined up, Allison. The first question, this person writes, I know you mentioned Jonas Mekas. Are there any other writers who inspired this project or other projects?
Oh, yes. I mean, I feel like text really is a starting point for many of my bodies of work. Um, for instance, in a work of mine, History as Hypnosis, my brother's poem, my brother Matthew Nguyen, is kind of a counter-mythology in the work, and actually this introduction sort of from reality before the speculative fiction begins. Um, in other works, I've collaged machine learning text, using online text, online writers, social media, and whatnot, as a basis for generating language. So yeah, I think of writers not only as authors, of books, but also in terms of text and hypertext. But poetry, I think, is a through line in the work. My background is as a writer. That's what I went to undergrad for. And so I think like that's just something in my bones that I always respond to, you know. And for me, filmmaking became a way, and editing especially became a way of writing. But I still do kind of go back to text, as this like grounding force in the work. Yeah, Sylvia Federici was very important to me, as I mentioned, and then writers, songwriters as well in this. Min, I'm blanking on her last name. Min Lee, who wrote on Bolero. There's a really great essay in the newsprint about her and about like the work that she's done researching Bolero. So a combination of scholarly articles, poetry, found text. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. I have a sort of follow-up question to that. And I'm thinking about translation, and I know you mentioned this in your conversation as well. And I'm also thinking about the sort of translation of analog processes in film to their digital presentation throughout the show. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about that process of transfer or
Hmm.
what that looks like, I guess.
Yeah, I'm not a purist whatsoever with analog media. For me, I make digital adjustments to analog media and very freely, and fluidly, and unapologetically, I suppose. I feel like we are in post cinema, where everything, becomes digitized at a certain point. Um, and so intervening in that in analog materials is interesting to me. But usually there is experimentation that I do very manually, right? Before I take it into the digital realm and manipulate it. For me, to be nerdy, it's a bit like research, right? Like understanding time through direct animation, the repercussions of time, the labor of time within cinema, right? But I really like the idea of mixing all these different formats, in one total work, which, is essentially about time and movement. Um, yeah.
Thanks for that answer. Our next question comes from the audience, and they write, "This is regarding the film Aisle 9. I felt the chemistry among the actors created a powerful intimacy that penetrated to the viewers as well. I'm curious to learn more about the relationship among the actors, especially the protagonists of the film, the slightly older guy and woman who seem to be in charge of the warehouse staff's layover. Are they also artists? How did their relationships with you affect the filmmaking process?"
Oh, wow. That's so great. I like that question. Um, yeah, so in most of my live action films, I like to mix actors, performers of different orientations. Some untrained, that I meet on the street, online, um, professional actors who I just gravitate towards, and then, performers I meet. I mean, I love this app. What's it called? Backstage. I think like actors are so much tougher and more brave than many artists, to put oneself out there for projects in the way that they do is just really inspiring. But yeah, it was a mix of friends, people I did not know, people I instinctively felt would be good for the part. The producers I worked with were wonderful and, scoured their old call sheets, friends of friends to find people. And, this was definitely the most scripted work that I've made, in part out of practicality. We had a very limited amount of time and resources to make this. And so I didn't want to put all of that pressure on performers to improvise, even though that's something I generally do prefer. Um, so, a lot of banter is unscripted, but the dialogue for the most part is something that I wrote that I encouraged actors to take and mangle and make it their own. Like I'm really not so married to my own writing, if that makes sense. I really want performers to use it as a point of departure, right? And change it. And I often ask, what would your character say here, right? Take my lines and just throw it out. It's sort of more like an anchoring point or a vector, right? I think motivation or that kind of energy is important to describe for actors, but I always say like the script is a fake script. Like you should feel free to suggest changes. And I love those kinds of performers who show up to a set and they're ready to go. They don't ask questions. They're like their own kind of, very stubborn artist. I'm really attracted to those kinds of people, which was like, who Les was the I don't want to say main character because I don't really think in those terms, but he is definitely the conspiracy theorist in the film. He's the one who's questioning authority constantly. And he was definitely a trained actor. I felt like for that role, the vertebrae needed to be somebody who was very comfortable improvising and in that kind of position. And then non-actors, I think, helped create some of the intimacy. I also love the instincts that non-actors bring to a piece. It's a different texture. Often it requires a little bit more editing work on my part. Um, but I often have a very strong hand in the edit. So when I'm shooting, I know kind of what I can cheat and what I can let play out and what angles I need to get to make a very perhaps chaotic scene work. But knowing this and being involved in both the pre-production and the post-production has helped me, I think, create these situations on camera or in an edit which feel very close and cohesive. But really, we were trapped, not trapped. We were in a warehouse together in the cold for, 3 days. And so I think there was a lot of bonding that took place just through that experience. Yeah.
Thank you for that wonderful answer, Allison. Our last question in the Q&A comes from an audience member who's curious about how you landed on the number of channels in the installation. Did you try different numbers of channels or different compositions? Yeah.
Yeah, that was in part dictated by the form of the sculptures, right? So I've used pegboard carts or A-frame carts in my work before, and I wanted to kind of create these more human-like um, forms, but not have it be so strict throughout the installation. Um, and so yeah, I think the number of channels really arose from that desire, wanting to throw a wrench into it, which I think you might see in the pegboard cart that is behind the main screen, the glass screen, where it's just one arm, monitor arm that's like hanging out into the space of the main channel. Um, yeah, and then thinking through, how one travels through the space and how sound travels through the space. So it was really a series of just formal decisions that had to do with these objects. I wanted
Thank you.
to add more channels. But then I was like, wait, too many channels, too many channels. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that question, and thank you for that answer, Allison. That concludes our audience Q&A today. And we are going to be concluding our program with a excerpt from the film. And while I'm pulling that up, Allison, I'll give you a chance to sort of introduce it.
Sure. Aisle 9 is a speculative fiction, as we've mentioned, which, I started, not so long after October 7th, and then sadly has become very close to our reality. Workers in a stocking warehouse have to deal with, very harsh conditions in the outside world. And we don't know exactly what those are, but we can feel it, I think, through their bodies, and how they carry themselves in this space. I the company is going out of business. Things are not looking good. So the matriarch of this warehouse, a woman named Helena, who's a very kind of colorful, borderline alcoholic, really, really loves her crew. Takes on a new tenant, World Global Services. Those are the boxes that you see in the background, which kind of tear apart the fabric of this workforce. This new client really changes their day-to-day operations. They lie about the weight of the boxes. Things become quite dangerous. Um, and suspicion arises. And in this scene, they begin to go into the World Global Services boxes and find censored material that they begin to play.
Dù cho mưa, tôi xin đưa em đến cuối cuộc đời. Dù cho mây hay cho bão tố có kéo qua đây, dù có gió lạnh đầy, có tuyết buồn lầy, có lá buồn gầy. Dù sao đi nữa tôi cũng yêu em. Tựa vai nhau cho nhau yên vui ấm áp cuộc đời, tìm mỏi nhau cho nhau giá nát tim đau. Vừa đôi tay ước muốn tù đầy tóc rối bạc màu vết máu tình sâu. Nhìn em giây phút muốn nói yêu em. Xin cho tôi như cơn ngủ.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Allison and Lumi, for this rich dialogue today. We'd also like to thank the Tiger Foundation and the Marion Bolton Kippy Stroud Foundation for their support of our program and our growing archive. Um, sorry.
Can I thank the storefront team?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, Jessica Kwok, amazing curator who really nurtured this work and found resources for it and, helped me give birth to this wild animal. And to the entire staff at Storefront. I mean, this was such a challenging project to put together for a small team. And I'm just so grateful for all of the extra effort that went into this.
We'd also like to give a special shout out to Eduardo and Ryan Austin from Storefront for Art and Architecture for their support in preparing for today's event. The Rail has been free and independent for 25 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're available, join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Michelle Silva and Chrissy Isles on the event of Bruce Conner, Recording Angel, at the Marciano Art Foundation in Los Angeles. And as is Rail tradition, we now invite you to unmute and say hello and goodbye as you leave today.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allison. Thank you, Lumi.
Again.
Congratulations, Allison.
Thank you. So good to see so many familiar
Thank you
faces.
so much.
Bye. Thank you
so much. That was wonderful.
Yeah.
Such a lovely dialogue. Thank you.
Did I ramble?
Bye, everybody. Take care.
Bye. Thank you.